Yeah.
Snoring.
They're cheaper.
Not in this one, though. Talking about asking questions for Tell the joke.
They're all gonna come. John's got it.
You just stepped over that chair.
Not 101.
You measured all my dictionaries reference.
We were in here.
He was on one side of the road.
Right.
Supposed to be. Yeah, is that a new picture?
Floor's yours.
I almost did it. Do what?
Floor's yours,
Look
brother.
around.
Okay.
Did you draw that?
Back down.
What?
Did you draw that?
Yeah, I did. I sketched it out on the way down. Okay, guys, let's get started so we can get the show on the road here. This is Gigantopithecus. Most of us in this room are sort of on board with the hypothesis that we're dealing with a relic species of Pleistocene ape. Hey, am I going to separate you two? I think I am. Oh, wow. I ain't playing. Trust me, I ain't playing.
In class.
And the sad part is they're both teachers, so they should. So this, of course, is Russell Shahan. He's sort of the guru of what's current anthropological thinking behind Gigantopithecus. He sort of stepped out of the realm for a little bit.
Who did you say that was?
Russell Shahan.
I think it's
Bill
Bill
Munns. Oh, that's Munns?
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's what he made behind him.
Yeah,
I stand corrected.
He made
It's Bill Munns.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Russell Shahan comes up later, so he's from Iowa State. Okay, I thought this was pretty telling. Statement of conservation for our perspective. The most common and persistent factor that adversely affects populations of wild primates is loss of usable habitat.
Here.
Zhao Lingxia, he's a kind of a renowned archaeologist in China. And then Uncle Hervé said, among the largest mammal species that suffer dramatic reduction of their distribution area to the point of becoming endangered or even extinct are hominoid primates such as the orangutan, pongo, and the giant ape, Gigantopithecus. So I think that's a pretty telling statement. We're talking about an archaeological animal that's supposedly extinct, but we see the implications here for our target species. So, background.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, it was right. You have it on there?
It looks the same.
Hold on a minute. I'll try it.
Yeah, just click your arrow to the right button.
Yeah,
That
that's
goes
not
to the
it
next.
though.
It looks like there was some writing down in the picture.
Yeah, that's
Or these bullet points that are supposed to drop down or something?
no,
There you go.
that's not it. That's
No?
those are my sources for the pictures. Okay, well I can fill it in. I think basically we're looking at a Pleistocene ape that lived from about 1.7 million years ago to somewhere around 300,000. The dates are still arguable,
Right.
but you're looking at the lower Pleistocene into the middle Pleistocene, with sort of a die-off sometime in the beginning of the late Pleistocene. From tooth weight ratios, they estimate somewhere between 200 and 300 kilograms. So you're looking at well over 650 pounds, maybe 700 pounds.
kilograms to a pound.
They're known from about 2,000 specimens of teeth, first found by Uncle Gustav here von Koningswald. He was a Dutch paleontologist that was looking for dinosaurs in China in the 1930s and found these crazy looking teeth they called dragon teeth in apothecaries or pharmacies. They were using it to ground up for to use as an aphrodisiac or some kind of crap. And so he recognized them to be something special. That was in 1934. 1954 was the first in situ excavation of a Gigantopithecus tooth.
What year?
1954, also in China. They found 4 jaws now. Used to be 3. There's a couple of partial jaws. There's one that was found in Java, which I have no information on because the report is in some kind of strange language that I can't speak. So, and
2014.
also, yeah, 2014. So,
Very recent.
so possibly a 5th jaw. They basically look like this. This is the before the Java one. This is the one that was found also in 2014 in a cave in southern China. So,
Why would it just be the jaws that they find?
Like, why would those become?
It's the
so
fact
big?
that they're even finding the jaws is pretty remarkable. At these sites, which I'll get into in a minute, hopefully, if I hopefully have some, there are lots of teeth of other faunal assemblages. Lots of it's a small mammoth, a horse. I'll get into that in a minute, but since the enamel in the tooth is one of the hardest substances in the body, that's naturally what's going to stick around. So we're lucky to even have, there's no postcranial remains of this animal at all.
So everything is just extrapolated from this.
Everything's extrapolated from this and over 2,000 teeth. So, and most of what we think of the size and the bulk and possibly bipedalism comes from the jaw. And that's still
Yeah, it should be a big, because I mean, that's the way paleontology works by and large. You get a tooth or a jaw or a forearm and they extrapolate and paint this entire picture of the animal or whatever.
Oh yeah,
you know?
yeah, sure. And that changes.
Yeah.
Sometimes they find out that they're wrong. So a little bit more of the natural history. They're considered to be part of the Stegodon Alluropoda fauna complex. Alluropoda is giant panda. Stegodon is a small elephant-like animal. And so there's this cluster of this complex of Pleistocene megafauna that's only found in this particular region of China, and that's why they call it that. And Gigantopithecus is included in that. Consists primarily of a diet of C3 plants, which is fruits, leaves, stems, tubers, but also possibly bamboo. I'll get into that in just a second. I'm not the biologist here, I know we have a couple, but C3 plants, C3, C4, that's a photosynthesis pathway, but basically it's a way that you can study the dietary preference of a particular animal. Deer and elk, things like that, are usually C4 grazers and browsers. C3, it's more of a, well, diet most similar to Pan troglodytes, which is the chimp, which is kind of shows a wide breadth, but it's mostly understory vegetable matter, understory plants, but could also include fungi and ferns. We know this from dental microwear texture analysis under the microscope. What that involves is anytime, usually any animal, they can do it with humans, they've done it with hominids, but you leave microscopic striations and pits on the teeth that can relatively show your last 2 or 3 weeks worth of food that you've been eating, and after that it just grinds down into something else. But they've studied enough to where they can tell how many pits versus scratches, what types of food that you're eating, including meat. So that's how we know that's what their diet looked like mostly. There's some other methods to determine C3, which I'll get into in a second as well. So this indicates a habitat of subtropical, mixed deciduous, and evergreen forest with full canopy. And that's kind of important, I think, especially in relation to our target species. And they know this from stable isotope analysis, which is a very complicated subject I don't care to get into, and palynology, which is a study of ancient pollens. They extract pollens from their teeth, and that's another way they can tell the type of habitat. They're found mainly in limestone karst caves. Believe my next slide. No, not yet. It has to do with the geology of limestone, but I have a picture later on that shows you the type of topography. It's really interesting stuff. A lot of big tower-looking structures, small mountains that are just sort of eroded away, and they typically have lots of caves. So that's where they're finding these things.
Like that picture right there where it's got the line up, that's all just like an artist's rendering of what the Gigantopithecus looked like.
I was actually gonna include a special slide. I decided not to, that only covered how many depictions of this thing there are now.
Right.
It used to be Munn's.
Right.
And sort of that came from the 90s. But now there's every Tom, Dick, and Harry that can draw has come up with all kinds of interesting renditions of this thing. And some of them are pretty comical and hilarious.
You said they found the teeth in the caves?
Yes.
Did they think that that's where they lived, or did something?
No. And I talked to Daryl about this earlier because it kind of dawned on me about 4 o'clock this morning. But there's really only a couple of studies that where they actually did taphonomy of the site, which means the study of the site formation processes and how these things were deposited. And they think that it was porcupines that dragged them in and gnawed on them, and maybe gnawed on the bones or whatever, because there's a whole assortment of teeth, which I'll show you in a minute, hopefully.
Because apes don't live in caves. That's what you told me.
But, no, what I'm saying is that the Chinese are notorious for doing shoddy archaeological studies. They're just now, like in the last 15 years, getting to where they use a 1/4-inch screen to screen all their backfill, which modern archaeology has been doing that for over 100 years. And so there's a lot of stuff they didn't even catch. And there's no telling what they haven't caught. So they're not doing the proper types of analysis of how these sites were formed. In some cases, they were exposed by farmers that were digging these caves for fertilizer.
Wow.
So, but in any case, my point is that we think that porcupines have dragged them in, but there's dozens of these cave sites all over China and actually Southeast Asia. And so it's really a stretch to say that it's only being carried in by scavengers or rodents. Not to say that they were living in the caves, but we'll kind of get into that in a sec. So, here's the Stegodon Aleuropoda fauna. Of course, Gigantopithecus, Cervus. You've got your deer and your red stags and elk. Types of an extinct type of cow. You've got rhesus macaques. A couple of different kinds of pig. Tapirs, rhinos, bears, pandas, hystrix, which I believe is they call it hog badger.
These are all
Hog-faced badger.
contemporaries with Gigantopithecus?
Yes, these are all in the same complex. Megalovis is like kind of like a muskox type of animal, and Stegodon, which is an elephant type, a mammoth type, and then Hespitherium, which is more of a ground sloth. The reason why I include this is important. What do you guys see right here? Where have we seen that before?
Oh, yeah.
It's kind of this is shown from the slide.
Image of the Sasquatch.
Pete Travers.
Yeah.
So many of you have probably seen this image.
He
by this
drew
artist.
Barron. He did a rendering of Barron's.
So the guy that did Barron's, his little, what do you call it?
Sketch.
Yeah,
Sketch. Artist sketch.
Right.
Rendering.
This is from a Chinese paper that came out in 2008, I believe. And in their description, and interestingly enough, they don't really use pie charts anymore in anthropology. I'm not sure why, but Chinese do. But this is just sort of a graphic depiction of the percentages of from a particular site, from the Mo Hui cave, that came out of that site. And they ripped a freaking graphic of a Bigfoot.
That's Travers is.
Look at it.
Yes,
That's
Pete
our
Travers.
cutout we
Get
used
out.
in a Chinese scientific
In fact,
paper.
in fact, he called that one the Southern Sasquatch, is what Travers called that one.
I should have gotten a graphic of that just to show you.
That's
But when I saw that, I just
seen
I did a double take. I was
Hey,
like,
Paul, did
Now,
you
didn't
these
you?
other animals?
Yeah,
Have
it's
we
the white-
found
it's the
remains
white
of
one.
them in North
We've
America?
got it on our website.
I'm gonna get to that.
Okay.
I'm gonna get to that. That's
Hold
key.
your questions, please, to the
That's
end.
that's
You see it.
important.
I know about it.
Don't make me thump you.
This is just kind of a map of the region. You've got Longupo and a couple other caves in northern China. You've got this one out here in western China. But most of the complex is down here in southern China, and then you
They're
get a
all
little,
over.
you get a little back. Yeah, it covers a pretty good,
That's a big area.
good stretch of ground. So,
Paul, there's a pointer on that device too.
oh, excellent. So here we go. This little Bigfoot creature here,
Why did you do
Pete
that?
Travers, ripped from the headlines.
Travis Lawrence said the one he shot at through the thermal looked just like that.
I
He
doubt
showed
highly
us.
seriously that he knows that his graphic is being used in a Chinese paper. So, okay. So morphology, well, this is back on the my previous slide. This is kind of weird. I should have probably gone over this before with you, but it's okay. It works. 200 to 300 kilograms. There's no evidence of bipedalism. That's sort of our theory that we like to hold to, but there's also no evidence that it wasn't.
Right.
And we'll get to that in a minute as well. Strong evidence of sexual dimorphism, inferring that there was intense male-to-male competition or single-male, multi-female mating strategies, basically like gorillas. That's what sexual dimorphism, that's pretty much what it's for. And we're extrapolating this from the teeth, and we don't really know
Yeah.
until we actually get a skull and some postcrania. If it was bipedal, estimates of 10 to 12 feet tall. We also see an increasing complexity of the occlusal surface, the biting surface of the molars, all throughout the Pleistocene. So from the earliest Pleistocene sites all into the middle Pleistocene, you're starting to see a complexity of the surface and an enlargement as well, which is kind of indicative of adaptation to climate change. So we're going to get into the archaeology here. This is sort of what the karst topography looks like. you've got these large spires. You see it a lot in Thailand and Laos and the coastal region of China. It creates a lot of caves. Again, the taphonomy of just a few of these sites indicates that they were transported in by porcupines. I've got some questions about that. I'm going to look into it. But you've got all these different cave sites. Here's just another addition. These are mostly cave complexes. It's not just one single cave. There's usually 3 or 4 cave sites within that region or that particular area, and they're getting material out of all of them. So, and then right here, this is not a very good picture, but you see these little white dots? These are all caves. These are actual cave sites. So this is actually, they call this Mulan Mountain right here.
So they made the movie?
And this is the Chongzuo complex down in southern China. I included this slide just to kind of show you, this is not really the best depiction of where they found the tooth samples, but it does show the geology of the different horizons from bedrock that are deposited in these caves. And also, interestingly, it shows, this is one way that they date some of these sites. It's paleomagnetometry. And what, many of you probably know that the Earth's magnetic poles shift, and we've been able to date that throughout time. I think the last pole shift was about 77,000 years ago. So, and there's actually evidence now that the pole's shifting again. So we're kind of due for another pole shift. I'd like to see how that's going to mess with your brains, right? But, so basically like right here, this is normal, this is reverse. So these are various periods of polar shifts. And you can measure that in specific volcanic rocks. You can actually see where the magnet, it's hard science, let's put it that way. And it's pretty compelling stuff, but it's not, you know, it's also relative dating, so you're not going to get exact dates. You're just basically saying, well, the rocks above and below where this fossil was found, you know, the pole is this way, the pole is that way down here, and we know the dates for both of them, so you can kind of do this relative dating sequence. So, and this is the KK cave, and you can see it's not easy stuff. There's very little, strangely, there's very little documentation of some of these sites. Like again, like I said, the Chinese are just not very savvy. They don't like to share data, and there's some nationalistic implications as well, which I'll get into later.
Paul, I've got a question, if you don't mind.
Yes, sir.
Going back. We're seeing these magnetic changes, right? That could imply changes in, ecosystems and environmental changes that are created with those pole shifts.
That's a good question.
And do you see speciation changes through these periodic?
That's an excellent question, and I don't know that anyone's looked at that. But it kind of begs the question: what does a magnetic pole shift do to the local environment? What does it do to animal species? And I don't know the answer to that. And I don't know that anyone's looked at that.
Some of the stuff that I've read about the pole shifting, because it's turning into a pretty hot topic right now because people think it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Like relatively speaking, anytime.
Well, they're starting to see where it's actually starting to shift.
Right.
I mean, it's in like microdegrees right now, but it's still shifting.
But in none of the articles that I've read about it has anyone talked about any environmental change that foreseen. They just don't talk about it. They just think it's going to be like, whoop, there goes the poles.
It may not be thought about.
The reason I bring it up is you see the Blackie, right? Gigantopithecus. You see it span 2 changes here, and that supports an idea of adaptability, right? And
right.
That's important.
We'll get to that in a minute too, so it's kind of important. Again, my words are gone. Actually,
There they are. Well, hold on.
What program, what
What
did you use to build this?
PowerPoint.
Really?
A PC.
On a Mac.
That's
On a Mac, really?
Yeah, no wonder.
Well, that's
Correct. Turning over.
Okay. Well,
I don't know how to move your.
There's a secret map behind that.
Reveal it.
What?
there
I
should be.
don't know how to fix this.
Have you ever done PowerPoint before?
Oh, yeah, but I don't move my text like this.
right.
Go
Wait.
Go to a line. Put them on the right hand side. Hey. He's got a Mac.
It's not,
It's the same
it's a
laptop.
Macintosh.
Thank you, Brian.
Never happened to me.
Okay. Well,
Here we go.
this is Mohui Cave, 1.7 million years ago, and they know that from ESR and uranium series dating. Again, it's very typical of this Stegodon, Aurotophoda, Aleophoda faunal complex. You've got the Gigantopithecus these are the Gigantopithecus teeth, and you've got some other species here. That, like I said, they're very stereotypical of this faunal complex. That's part of the stegodon. It's like a front premolar, as you know, kind of a mammoth, a small mammoth-sized elephant. But what's interesting about this site is you've got these stone tools, and if you know anything about stone tools, they're not the best-looking stone tools. But it's worth noting that in China, most of the stone tools, at least going back into the early and middle Pleistocene, they look like shit. They're basically chopping tools. They're pebble and flake technology, so they're real basic. But you do see some flake scars on some of them. So,
Who used those tools?
we don't know. The next site's gonna hopefully, if it's still there, which it's not. This, I believe, is.
Right and left for movement, right and left for command, right and left.
Well, that's something, there used to be, you could.
Well, this particular site has a plethora of stone tools. There we go.
Hey!
All right, thank you.
Next up.
So this is Longgupo. This is in northern China. This is a pretty key site because this is the site where a hominin fossil was found, parts of a jaw, and these associated incisors. And
With Giganto?
with Giganto, Russell Shahan from Iowa State, he basically declared it. They thought they were kind of leaning towards Homo habilis. Of course, there are no Homo habilis fossils in China or anywhere out of Africa for that matter. So it's kind of a big deal for a long time. And he subsequently retracted that in 2009, came out with this paper, basically said I was wrong, and actually made a case for divorcing Homo erectus from the stegodon, the Elaeropoda faunal complex, that's a whole other topic we can talk about later if you want. But
So we don't know who that is?
we don't know who that is. We don't know what hominid that is, but we do know that they have these stone tools, and some of these are pretty good. That's a good one there. This edge right here, you can't really see it in the slide.
Northern China?
This is northern China. So what's interesting is that, and I think I talked about this on the forum one time, but Russell Shahan says, well, so he's claiming that it's some other ape, like a chimp or a gorilla-sized ape, not Gigantopithecus, but also not Homo.
Another Bongi.
Right. But then you can't account for these stone tools.
Right.
And then what his answer is, well, they must have just come from someplace else. That was his stock answer in a paper. So that's about the most unscientific statement I think I've ever heard. But he can't account for them. But he wants to double or backtrack on the Homo argument and say that these are not a hominid.
What's Unk ape?
What's
Unk ape?
Unknown.
unknown?
Oh, unknown. Okay.
So interestingly enough,
I've never heard of it before.
the Chinese are still claiming that they still stick to the fact they think this is Homo habilis, and there's some political and nationalistic reasons for that have nothing to do with science. So, but at the end of the day, we don't know who that is. So
So are you suggesting that these could belong to Gigantopithecus?
no, I'm not making that suggestion at all.
Okay.
I don't have no idea.
All right. And nobody else has made that
No.
suggestion?
No, not at all. So, okay, that's good. Yeah, this is more Longgupo. You can see here the scale of this site. Basically, it's a collapsed cave, and you had all these layers that fell down on top. This gives us some scale.
That guy got buried?
No. Yeah, something like that. So it's pretty tough stuff. It's not as simple as walking into a cave and, oh, hey, there's a bone or there's some teeth. Let's dig them up. So this is a pretty in-depth excavation.
Is that common for these cave complexes to be collapsed like that? Or
It is.
Okay.
So my
There's a
understanding,
sinkhole where it's like a cone.
right? My understanding of karst topography has to do with limestone and water flow, and what happens is you get erosion underneath a tougher layer, and then it just collapses on top of it or something like that. So. Again, I got out of geology I got into anthropology to get away from math. Now I'm swimming in math. Okay, that's good. Thank you, sir. So, and as I said before,
Check that out.
the site from Java, which is 2 or 3 years old, I have no data on it whatsoever. It's a partial jaw. with some pretty good sized teeth. I don't know anything because there's nothing in English. So,
Yeah.
and the journal is some obscure journal from Sumatra. So never heard of it yet. So I wouldn't mind getting a hold of a translation of it.
In what language?
It looked almost like Dutch or something. I couldn't tell what it was.
That shouldn't be.
So,
The Giganta looks like it was just walking along, you know, he's
yeah,
like,
I mean, he popped out at it.
I mean,
What?
My friend.
What did I do?
That is supposed to be Homo erectus here. These guys. So,
Sure.
why is it? Yes, sir.
Have you checked with your university? We've gotten, usually our foreign languages department, they like to, the students like to help out with.
If I can
translating
figure
things
out
like
actually
that.
what language it's in, I'd be
It
more
could.
because
The Dutch own that area.
it doesn't look like an Asian language. That's what's
Let me
so
see
odd.
it.
Okay, I'll show it to you. But that would be something.
I would definitely reach out to any of your foreign language departments, so I
Okay.
could do the same.
And we have a lot of
Yeah,
Malaysian students on campus. as
Oh,
well,
yeah,
so.
I think you could do
Okay, so what do we really know versus what speculation? We know, again, from studies of their dentition and doing particular studies with DMTA and uranium series and palynology, that they definitely had a C3 diet in
I
a
thought there was
closed
some
camp.
question about that. They were more of a, maybe more of a generalist in their diet
Well,
in recent years.
my next point there is that the morphology of their tooth, the actual structure of the tooth, shows that they were equipped to handle more fibrous, tougher dietary items like bamboo. But it's not reflected in the C3 versus C4. Yes?
In their studies of pandas, when they eat their bamboo, they said the older ones have pretty darn worn down molars, where they almost can't even eat them anymore because they're so worn down.
Well, why this is important is because and this is why I think it's cogent to our target species, is that they were living primarily on a particular type of vegetable product, the C3 suite of plants. And so everything was on the ground, everything was under the canopy. They didn't have to climb trees to get to the fruit. They could get what was hanging down low, but they had a pretty good breadth of diet, even within the C3 suite. C4s were more open grassland, more savanna, more plains-like, a lot of grasses, and so they weren't subsiding on that.
Yeah. Then again, pandas, they eat predominantly bamboo,
Bamboo.
and so they would
Almost
wear
so.
down their
Right.
molars faster.
This is true.
They may be selected.
Primarily bamboo. They obviously had
Yeah.
Giganto had a much wider diet
Yeah.
selection, even with the suite of C3 greens, if you will. So this is where science gets tricky. So there's basically evidence of you see the shifting pattern of migration from northern China into southern China, and from southern China farther south into North Vietnam, Laos, and then ultimately into Java. And this is through time and space. So it sort of
The wrong
infers
vector. Wrong
that
vector.
that there was something happening in their environment, and they were basically shrinking, and so they were having to go follow the food, essentially, their preferred food. Okay, but we're only basing that off of the current sites that we have and the dates we have. And if they find a Gigantopithecus find in northern China that dates to 120,000 years ago, then that theory's out the door. So
What about Eastern Russia? That would be phenomenal.
that's my point. Is it?
Yeah.
And my next slide should uncover that. But they think that it went extinct about 300,000 years ago. Okay, what's speculative is it went extinct about 300,000 years ago. That it was bipedal. Again, we don't have any evidence of that. We have no postcranial material whatsoever. That they were tree climbers. I read somewhere on one of the Bigfoot deal that that's why this guy went extinct, is because there was a loss of trees because of more of a savanna-like environment that was sort of taken over that region, and so they couldn't climb trees to get food, so they died off. Well, there's no evidence that they had to climb trees. Everything they needed was under the canopy, was on was in the understory. And then the fact that they were associated and overlapped with Homo erectus. Just because we have that one site where you've got some sort of hominin, we don't know what it is, associated in the same cave deposit with Giganto. Excluding that, just because they're not found together. The theory is that Homo erectus was more of a savanna-based hunter, and that they weren't going into the jungles to get food. I don't just because you're not finding the fossils in there doesn't mean that they weren't using that type of environment for resources. So they definitely overlapped in time and space. Just because they're not found in the same assemblage doesn't mean that they didn't coexist, is my point. So, okay. 2 things to remember. Evidence of absence is not absence of evidence, and correlation is not causation. So this is very cogent to our quest for this elusive beast that we call wood apes. Just because we're not finding things doesn't mean it's not true or doesn't exist. So this is one of the constraints of science, is that all we can go off of is what we find, we make inferences off what we find, but there's so much that we don't know about things we haven't found. So this is something we should always keep in mind.
So you're not suggesting that they died from beetles back in the moon?
From what?
Yeah.
No. I just threw that in there for fun. So again, this is some of the pop culture stuff that comes up on the internet. So
Very good.
What's up with these tax boxes? Why did that?
I have no idea. All right, let's talk about Beringia a little bit. You can move that photo down if you want to, Brian. So there's some interesting things about Beringia that probably most people don't think about or don't even know about. The time span is roughly 135,000 years ago to about 11,000 years ago, with intermittent openings and closings all along that. That's basically the last ice age. Interestingly, it covers about 620,000 square miles. It was from top to bottom about 1,000 kilometers in width. So you're looking at a landmass
500 to 600
almost 3 times the size of Texas. So that's a lot of ground. I think where some people have made the mistake of assuming that there was this narrow corridor, like Moses parting the Red Sea,
Yeah, right.
and it was created this bottleneck, and all of a sudden all these animals rushed through, including humans, modern humans, and that's just not the case. We know that it essentially was what they call a mammoth tundra, which is a sort of a shrub steppe environment, lots of large grasses and shrubs and things of that nature, which lend itself to things like mammoth and extinct bison, horse and camel and things like that. It was also slightly warmer than that region is today. It's not to say it was tropical, but it was definitely a few degrees centigrade warmer, which is going to have a shift in the type of ecology you've got there. Interestingly enough, on the eastern half, so you've got the McKenzie River here, which is sort of the eastern boundary of Beringia, and then you've got the Lena River in western Siberia as the western boundary. And of course, at certain times, it completely covered the Aleutians and Kamchatka, the peninsula there. But in the eastern half, there's fossil evidence and pollen evidence that it was occupied by pine, spruce, birch, and poplar forest. So something to think about. There's also this prevailing theory of what they call Beringia standstill. And so you've got thousands of years of time where these whole regions were distinct ecoregions that were constantly fluctuating, constantly changing, and a lot of this had to do with the ice caps, the actual glaciers. So they created a wall right here, but everything else here was open because there was no glaciation over here. There was very little snowfall in this entire region up until where the glaciers hit. So you've got this entire region occupied by all these megafauna, all these animals, and living in a very diverse, thriving ecosystem for thousands of years. This wasn't a small window. Now, when people think about Beringia, they mainly talk about Paleo-Indians and their migration from Asia into North America. And it is true that the last opening of the actual channel, the ice channel, if you will, they call it the McKenzie Channel, was somewhere between 16 and 15,000 years ago, and it permanently closed, with the bridge permanently closed by the water levels rising around 11,000. So by then, you'd had these populations of humans migrating. But before that, you had all this big, vast region where animals could thrive and take care of themselves. So, sorry. And right here, this is sort of